So welcome back. We're going to switch angels now. And we're going to go from the falling black angels of George Crumb to the luminous apocalyptic angels of Olivier Messiaen. And if this is your first encounter with the music of Olivier Messiaen, I'll say that I think he was a completely unique voice in the music of the 20th century. There really isn't any other composer whose music reminds me of the music of Messiaen. His music really came out of this nexus of his deep, mystical Catholic faith, Gesundheit, and his deep love of the natural world. And he began to be recognized while he was still a student at the Paris Conservatory. He studied with Paul Dukas, who you may remember as the composer of The Sorcerer's Apprentice. And by the time he graduated, when he was only 23 years old, he had already been appointed to one of the most prestigious positions there in Paris, and that was as the organist of the Church of the Holy Trinity. And this was a position that really suited him very well, and he hung on to it for the next 61 years until the very end of his life in 1992. There were only a few years that he was not there. In 1939, the Nazis marched into Poland, and the rest of Europe began to mobilize for World War II. Messiaen was drafted into the French army, and he was 31 years old. And he was a person who, his eyesight was never very strong, and also he was by philosophy and by religion, he was a pacifist. And so he said, I'll serve, but I would like to serve in the medical corps. And they said, fine, and they sent him up to Verdun. And while he was there, he met two other very accomplished young musicians who had also been drafted into the French army. One of them was a Jewish Algerian clarinet player whose name was Henri Akoka. He had been a member of the French National Radio Orchestra in Paris until he was drafted. And the other was a very accomplished cellist whose name was Etienne Pasquier. And he was a member of a family string trio, the Pasquier string trio, with his old brothers Jean and Pierre. And they were quite well known in the middle of the 20th century. A lot of music was written for them. They made a lot of records. And so these three gentlemen became fast friends there at Verdun. And one day they were wandering in the forest outside of the city in June of 1940 when they encountered a platoon of German soldiers who arrested them. And they forced them to march 90 kilometers to the southeast to the town of Nancy. And they held them on a field outside of the town for 3 weeks while they decided what to do with them next. Now, it's worth noting at this point that Messiaen was not only a great organist and a great composer, but he was a great bird watcher. He could identify over 50 birds just by the sound of their calls alone. And he liked nothing more than to be out in open fields with his music manuscript paper, listening to the birds and notating their calls in musical manuscript. And somehow he managed to persuade his new friend, the clarinetist Henri, to get up with him at 3 in.the morning so they could go out into the middle of the field and they could listen to the awakening of the birds. And during that period, during that 3-week time, he put the finishing touches on a clarinet solo, which ultimately Henri premiered out there in that field. And it became known as the Abyss of the Birds. It became the third movement of the quartet for the end of time when it was finished. So after 3 weeks there on that field, the three of these musicians were herded up to Görlitz, Germany, on the border of Poland. And this was a prisoner of war camp. It was not a concentration camp. This was not Auschwitz or Buchenwald. But the conditions there were very harsh nonetheless. It was very far north. The winters were long, freezing cold. The barracks where they stayed were minimally heated at best. There really wasn't enough food to go around. And people did suffer, and people did die there of exposure and overwork and exposure to the freezing cold weather. And some years later, when he came back to Paris, his wife, whose name was Yvonne Loriot, she was a great pianist and a great advocate of his music. She wrote about the experiences that he had while he was interred there at Stalag VIII-A. She said, he suffered a lot in captivity. Like the other prisoners, he lost his hair and his teeth. When he returned, he had swollen fingers, chilblains, because he hadn't eaten. The physical state of all the prisoners, though not as serious as those who were deported to the concentration camps, was terrible. But that said, again, it was not a concentration camp, and there were certain amenities that you wouldn't expect to find at Auschwitz. There was a lending library, there were chapels there, and there were opportunities for the prisoners to put on plays and to play music and to go to lectures and deliver lectures in order to keep themselves alive intellectually while they were imprisoned there. And the people who were imprisoned ran the gamut of all kinds of humanity, levels of education, professions. There were people who had been laborers and farm workers, but there were also people who had, in civilian life, had been lawyers and doctors and intellectuals and musicians like Messiaen and Pasquier and Akoka. And this wide diversity of humanity and educational backgrounds applied equally to the guards and the commandants of the camp there. Some of them were not committed Nazi ideologues. And one of them who fell into that category was this gentleman, Captain Karl-Albert Brüll. He was a lawyer in civilian life. He spoke fluent French because his mother was Belgian. And so he became a French translator for those people in the camp who spoke French. And like many of the commandants and the guards, he was a great and very sophisticated music lover. And he had high respect for the musicians who were there. And he managed to get a lot of them off of their work details. And for Messiaen, he actually knew who he was. He had a lot of admiration for him. And he found a place in the camp latrine where Messiaen could spend hours every day composing. And it was Brüll who would bring him music paper and pencils and erasers. And when he could get it, he would bring him extra rations of food to keep his creative fires stoked. That said, I mean, it was a latrine. It was not the Paris Conservatory. And again, Messiaen's wife, Loriot, wrote about what it was really like in her characteristically French, ironic voice. She said, "Imagine how moving it must have been. Poor Messiaen in the prisoner's toilet, used by 3,000 people. They weren't very clean. And he was locked up in the toilets so that no one would bother him, so that he could write the quartet. You see what kind of suffering he underwent." Now, Captain Brüll was also involved in getting playable musical instruments for the members of the quartet. And ultimately, he was involved in getting Messiaen and Pasquier released from the camp. Later in 1941, he actually forged the exit documents in such a way that made it look like they were not officially combatants in the French army, and that allowed them to return to Paris and their lives. He was not able to do the same for Henri Akoka because, as you will recall, he was Jewish. But he felt very responsible for the Jewish prisoners, and he tried to persuade them not to try to escape because he said, and I think rightly so, that in the early 1940s, if they were out in the open, they could be arrested, and they could be put into boxcars, and they could be sent off to the concentration camps. And this, in fact, is what happened to Henri Akoka's father, whose name was Abraham. In 1942, he was arrested for the crime of being Jewish, and he was sent to Auschwitz, and there he perished. Now, I've read a good deal about the backstory of the Quartet for the End of Time, and this character, Henri Akoka, he emerges in this narrative as being a completely indomitable man. I think of him as the Steve McQueen character in this prison drama, because although he was advised by Brüll not to try to escape, he ignored that advice, and he made a number of different escape attempts, and the last one was successful. There was a point where he had been transferred along with other Algerian prisoners out of Stalag 8A to Brittany, France, to another prison camp. And then for one reason or another, they were herded back into a boxcar and sent back to Stalag 8A. And I'll describe what happened in the voice of his sister. His sister was named Yvonne Dron. And she said, as the train passed through the French village of Saint-Julien-du-Sault, Henri asked his comrades to tie their belts together to form a rope. They opened a little overhead plank, hoisted him up on this makeshift rope, and slid him through the hole. And there, in the middle of the night, while the train was still rolling, he jumped. And what is extraordinary is that he jumped with his clarinet under his arm. The clarinet never left him. So he was later discovered unconscious, lying in a ditch by the side of the tracks. And some railroad workers, French railroad workers, scooped him up, took him to a local doctor who patched him up, and then rather heroically hid him for a full month until he and Henri decided that the coast was clear enough for him to head south to the free zone of Marseille, where he joined up with the members of the radio orchestra that he had left, and he sat out the remainder of the war. Now, this piece, we will later discover, was inspired by an angel of the apocalypse in the book of Revelations. But I keep thinking to myself that it probably would not have been written at all, certainly not in Stalag 8A, if it weren't for a literal guardian angel in the person of Karl-Albert Brüll. Early in 1940, they were joined by another musician. His name was Jean Le Boulaire. He was a violinist. And as you see in this headshot of him, he's a very handsome man. He looks a little like a movie star. In fact, in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, he changed his name to Jean Launier, and he became a movie star. Or something like it. He was an actor. He starred in, or I'm not sure if he actually starred in them, but he participated in French New Wave cinema from that period, and he worked with directors like Francois Truffaut. But in 1940, he was a violinist, and the other three musicians there were only too happy to have him as a part of their nascent ensemble. And so Messiaen, sitting there in the latrine, was looking for something to compose. And at that point in his captivity, there was still not a playable piano that he had at his disposal, so he decided that he would write a trio for these three instrumentalists, his new friends. So he wrote a short trio for clarinet, violin, and cello. And ultimately, like The Abyss of the Birds, which he wrote for Henri, it became a part of the Quartet for the End of Time. In the fourth position, he called it Interlude. And as you hear the music on Thursday night, you'll hear that the interlude in the middle of the piece is written in a different musical language. It's much more conservative in its style than the other movements. Most of the other movements don't have time signatures. They're free and their rhythms are rather complex. This one, on the other hand, is written in a recognizable 2/4 time and is very charming. The entire 8-movement piece was finished in early January of 1941. And it was premiered on the freezing cold night of January the 15th, 1941, in a small theater that was part of a barrack there And Messiaen himself remembered in rather vivid and I think hyperbolic terms this premiere. He exaggerated, I think for dramatic effect, what the premiere was like. He said that there were 5,000 people who attended the premiere, which would not have been possible. I don't think there were even 5,000 people being held in the camp at that time. And he said that the upright piano that he played had keys that didn't go up and down, and that may or may not be true. And he said that Pasquier played a cello with only 3 strings, and that is not true. Pasquier verified that this cello had 4 strings. But he said one thing that I think we can take at face value. He said, "Never was I listened to with such rapt attention and comprehension." And I think we can believe that because it corresponds to what Etienne Pasquier wrote in his own rather vivid memory of the premiere performance. Pasquier said, "The performance took place at 6 in the evening in the hut that was used as the theater. Everyone wanted to come and hear us, including the camp commanders. They sat in the front row. Our clothing was bizarre in the extreme. The 4 of us, Messiaen included, wore old Czech uniforms covered in patches with clogs on our feet, which were warmer and good for walking in the snow. All of the seats were taken, about 400. And the people listened raptly, even those who may have been listening to chamber music for the first time, their thoughts turning inward. It was extraordinary." I mentioned a few minutes ago that this piece was inspired by a vision of the angel of the apocalypse who came down and spoke to St. John in the 10th chapter of the book of Revelations. And I'll read you the beginning of that chapter because these vivid images are the ones that inspired Messiaen himself. "And I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet were as pillars of fire, and he set his right foot upon the sea, and his left foot upon the earth. And the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven and swore by him that liveth forever and ever that there should be time no longer." Now, I think it's worth noting that Messiaen wrote many, many pieces over the course of his long life. Fully half of them were inspired by biblical passages or have allusions to liturgical or theological subject matter. And regarding this piece, he wrote, "The quartet is directly inspired by this excerpt from the Revelation of St. John. Its musical language is essentially transcendental, spiritual, Catholic. Certain modes draw the listener into a sense of the eternity of space or time. Particular rhythms existing outside the measure contribute importantly toward the banishment of temporalities." And this is an important observation because this idea of there will be time no longer dovetailed rather well with his own concepts of what he wanted musical time to be like in his music. He did not want his music to be divided into regularly repeating metrical grids like 2/4 or 3/4 or 4/4 time. He said, "My music depends on uneven beats, as in nature. In nature, rippling water is uneven. Waving tree branches are uneven. The movement of clouds is uneven." And in his quest to find ways to write music with uneven rhythmic values, he studied very seriously the music of other cultures, particularly South Indian music. He got a hold of this 13th century musicological text, which describes in detail the rhythmic talas that Indian music are based on, these long sequences of complicated rhythms that to our westernized ears sound uneven. And even today, Indian music and Indian musicians, when they try to learn these long talas, they do so through a system of physical gestures, which look a little like this, and also through takadimi, these very rapid phonetic syllables, which are a lot of fun to listen to.
Tom nam tarikidum ta di tom nam tarikidum ta di tom nam tarikidum
tadittom nam tarikidum tadittom nam tarikidum tadittom nam tarikidum tadittom nam ta.
Yeah, don't try that at home. And Messiaen, he was fascinated by this kind of rhythm. He called it additive rhythms because they're based on small rhythmic cells that can be added to incrementally or subtracted from incrementally. And Messiaen, he based a lot of the pieces in this Quartet for the End of Time on exactly those kinds of rhythms that he encountered in Indian music. I think a good example of that is the sixth movement, which is called the Dance of Fury for the seven trumpets. And he evokes the sound of this long fanfare of the seven trumpets of the apocalypse by having all of the four instruments play in unison in this long sequence of additive rhythms. And Messiaen, he had a very poetic quality to him, and he wrote these long, colorful, poetic descriptions of each of the movements of the piece. I'll read you the one that he wrote of the Dance of Fury. He said, "It is music of stone, formidable sonority, movement as irresistible as steel, as huge blocks of livid fury or ice-like frenzy." And I dare you to try to tap your toe to this music. How did you do? And there's a related kind of rhythm that he introduced, which he called non-retrogradable rhythms. This is one of these overly complicated French terms for something which is fairly simple to understand. These are rhythms that go the same if you read them forward or backwards. And what I've done here is I've written out above in these colored numbers the number of 16th notes that are contained in each of these larger values. So a dotted eighth note has 3 16th notes in it, a half note has 8. And if you read it from forward or from backwards, it's the same rhythm. Later in the same movement, the Dance of Fury, he introduces a succession of 13 of these non-retrogradable rhythms back to back to back. And I'll play you some of them so you have a sense of what they sound like and that the effect that they make, maybe 6 or 7 of them. As you would imagine, it takes a fierce kind of concentration to play this music with absolute rhythmic and intonational security and synchronicity. Another way that Messiaen set out to banish our sense of the temporality of music, of time, was he introduced actual birdsong into his music. And this became a real signature technique of his music for the rest of his life. But the first time he did it in a systematic way was in the Quartet for the End of Time, right from the very beginning. The first movement is called the Crystal Liturgy. And my sense is that he was inspired by that time that he and Henri spent out on that field outside of Nancy, getting up and listening to the awakening of the birds. My sense is that because that's what he said. He said this movement takes place between the hours of 3 or 4 a.m. at the awakening of the birds. And it starts with a musical depiction of the sound of a blackbird. In dialogue with a nightingale. And we hear this musical conversation between the birds in the voices of the clarinet and the violin. And this happens over a very mysterious backdrop of unevenly spaced cello harmonics and crystalline piano chords. So these are the birds waking up on the morning of the apocalypse. And he called birds the opposite of time. He said, they are our desire for light, for stars, for rainbows, and jubilant songs. And he did include much more jubilant bird song in the third movement, the abyss of the birds. And that gesture, that roulade that goes from the bottom of the clarinet up to the top, is a motive that we hear over and over again in various movements of this piece. It binds many of the movements together. And in my reading about the piece, I couldn't find anywhere where Messiaen said this represents such and such. But my sense is that with its upward trajectory, it probably represents the hand of the angel pointed up toward heaven. And we hear it in the second movement. The second movement is called Vocalise for the Angel who announces the end of time. And it begins with a fanfare. We hear the sound of the piano crashing in, and then the clarinet comes playing exactly that gesture. And this fanfare goes on for a while, and then we get to the Vocalise for the angel who announces the end of time. And we hear it in the combined voices of the violin and the cello moving in tandem with each other, and they are again accompanied by the piano. And again, Messiaen writes this extremely vivid and rather colorful description of the sound. He says that it consists of gentle cascades of blue and mauve, gold and green, violet, red, blue-orange, all dominated by steel grays. Tell me if you see those colors. As his vividly colored description implies, Messiaen had an almost synesthetic sensitivity to the relationship between sound and color. And this went back to his earliest days when he was taken to worship at Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, and he saw these incredible stained glass windows. And he wrote later, "For me, that was a shining revelation, which I've never forgotten. And this first impression as a child, I was 10 years old at the time, became a key experience for my later musical thinking." And the third way that Messiaen set out to banish our sense of the temporalities, to disrupt our sense of the regular flow of time, was in certain movements, he prescribed such glacially slow tempo markings that we really do lose our sense of the forward flow of time. We hear this in the third movement, The Abyss of the Birds. Between those outbursts of jubilant birdsong, we hear these clarinet passages where just these immobile, sustained clarinet tones that really don't go anywhere at all. And there are two movements where he prescribes incredibly slow tempo marks, and they are related movements. The fifth movement, which is a sublime cello solo, for cello and piano, it's called Praise for the Eternity of Jesus. And the last movement, the eighth movement, which is a sublime violin solo, which is called Praise for the Immortality of Jesus. And both of these pieces were transcribed from earlier pieces that he had written in his life before his captivity. The fifth movement had its beginnings as the fourth movement of a large piece that accompanied this Las Vegas-style water display in 1937 at the Exposition in Paris. And he wrote this eight-movement piece. The fourth movement is called Oraison, oration. And he originally scored it for a group of 7 or 8 young women dressed in white gowns. And they're all playing identical Ondes Martineau. This is this strange, eerie-sounding electronic instrument, and I'll play you a bit of it. And 3 years later, while he was sitting there in the latrine looking for music to represent praise for the eternity of Jesus, he thought back on this and decided to transcribe it and transpose it up a few notes for cello and piano. Exquisitely played by Nick Canellakis and Michael Brown. And 20 years ago, Alex Ross, the wonderful critic for the New Yorker magazine, wrote an article about the Quartet for the End of Time, and I was amused by what he wrote about this movement. He said, "It is disconcerting to associate the Quartet for the End of Time with Moulin Rouge-style production values. To know that such a spectacle as the Festival of the Dancing Waters lies behind praise to the eternity of Jesus is to appreciate the many-sidedness of the composer's aesthetic, his ability to move in a flash from the mundane to the sublime. Messiaen expects paradise not just in a single awesome hereafter, but also in the scattered ecstasies of daily life. And I think it's also worth noting that, like George Crumb in his 13-movement Black Angels, Messiaen in his 8-movement Quartet for the End of Time imposed all kinds of levels of architectural symmetry, and you hear it in the titles of his Praise for the Eternity of Jesus, Praise for the Immortality of Jesus, these two very slow movements. We see another example of that in the second movement, Vocalise for the Angel Who Announces the End of Time, and the penultimate movement, the 7th movement, Cluster of Rainbows for the Angel Who Announces the End of Time. And it also has this sustained vocalise, which represents the angel of the apocalypse coming down and presenting himself to St. John with his head swaddled in rainbows. And there are certain musical similarities with the second movement. They both have these ecstatic vocalise sections. In the second movement, once the vocalise begins, it continues uninterrupted until the end of the piece, where there's just another replication of the fanfare from the beginning of that movement. This one, however, is interrupted periodically by these dissonant, pounding interludes, which I think must represent the human suffering that we would experience at this moment of the calamity of the apocalypse. And the final movement, the 8th movement, this is Praise for the Immortality of Jesus. And as I mentioned earlier, it is also based on a piece that he wrote before his captivity, 10 years before, as a matter of fact, not long after he took that position as the organist at the Church of the Holy Trinity. It's called Diptyque, or Diptyque. And he writes, Essay on Earthly Life and Blessed Eternity. It's for organ. And he said it is intended to create this sense of the timelessness of eternity. And as my final offering here, I found a recording of Messiaen himself playing it on the organ. And it is the slowest thing I ever heard in my life. And I'll play you some of it and then blend it into the final movement of the quartet for the end of time so you can see the relationship. Messiaen described this music as total love. He said, its slow rising to a supreme point is the ascension of man toward his God, of the mortal newly made divine toward paradise. So on Thursday and Saturday evenings, enjoy your rapid fall from grace in Black Angels and your slow ascent to paradise. Thank you.